Great. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our final session of the 2014 FPI Forum, A World in Crisis, the Need for American Leadership. It's a real honor to be joined by Governor Bobby Jindal of the great state of Louisiana and Senator Jim Talent for this final conversation, which will be focused on really a recent report that the governor and the senator co-wrote talking about rebuilding an American defense consensus. Earlier this morning, Senator Talent, we had a pair of your colleagues from the National Defense Panel, Ambassador Eric Edelman and Congressman Jim Marshall, speak. And one of the topics that they really focused on was, in addition to the requirements for the Department of Defense, was also thinking about how do you build a political consensus to restoring some of those requirements for the Department of Defense. Senator Talent, of course, is well known to those in this room. He represented Missouri both in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, where he was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He is now a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he's also heading the National Security 2020 project at AAI. Senator, it's a great pleasure to have you here today and an honor to have you both with Governor Jindal. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to FPI. It's my honor as the moderator, and I'll try just to moderate, not to talk too much, Governor, to introduce a good friend and a great American. I'm not going to embarrass you too much, but a man who has already built a great record in public service. Governor Bobby Jindal has served as the governor of Louisiana since 2008. Prior to his election to that office, he served in the United States Congress representing the 1st District of Louisiana. In Congress, he was elected president of his freshman class. He served on the House Committee on Homeland Security, the Committee on Education and the Workforce, and the Committee on Resources. He also served as Assistant Majority Whip. President George W. Bush had earlier appointed him to serve as Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and he was before that Executive Director of the National Bipartisan Commission on the Future of Medicare and Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be with you.
And great to be here with all of you, and again, thanks to FPI. We had fun writing that paper, didn't we?
Well, I want to thank you. You did a great job. I should thank FPI for having us, but I also, look, I want to praise the senator for just a minute here as well. I want to pay back those compliments, but also because this is so important. He has been a very thoughtful voice, cutting across party lines. I'm proud that he's Republican, but cutting across party lines, talking about the need to rebuild America's hard tools, about reinvesting in our military, not because he wants us to go to war or deploy our troops, but as a way to avoid having to deploy our troops. I think he's been thoughtful. He's been a consistent advocate. He has written extensively about this, back to his days in elected office and after leaving the Senate as well. So I just want to thank him. And again, working across party lines to help trying to rebuild, I think you described this very well. There was a post-World War II consensus, when you think about it, Democrat and Republicans, that allowed us to win the Cold War. Now, there were serious debates. I don't want to minimize. I don't want to pretend like everybody agreed on everything in every situation. But unfortunately, that consensus is broken down. In this post-Cold War environment, I'd argue we face a very serious threat from Islamic fundamentalist terrorism and other threats around the world. And unfortunately, that consensus is broken down. So I want to thank you for your leadership in trying to rebuild that bipartisan consensus.
Well, I appreciate that. We, in fact, called the paper, Rebuilding the American Defense Consensus. And most of the disagreements, if you stop and think about them, have been over how we're going to, or whether and when and how we're going to use the power, rather than whether we ought to have the power, especially since, as you said, if you're strong, you're less likely to have to use it. And of course, we talked about one great American who understood that better than anybody else.
That's right. You know, one of my favorite quotes from Ronald Reagan was that he talked about the 4 wars in his lifetime, and it was never advice for America to be strong. And I think that's exactly right. We've never lost a war by being too strong. No war was ever started because America was too strong. Ironically enough, preparing for war is the best way to avoid it. And one of the things we highlighted that is very concerning is we're in the process of hollowing out our military. And you can look at it across the Navy. We're in the process of having fewer ships. You look in the Air Force, we're in the process of having older planes. In the Army, we're in the process of having fewer troops. And it's got practical consequences. Just pick 2 examples from the recent headlines. There's a lot of concern about the Russia, not the Soviet Union anymore, about Russia in the Crimea in eastern Ukraine, and former satellites of the Soviet Union being very, very worried about what this means for them next. One of the most effective ways to deter Russian aggression, I believe, would be if we had the ability through NATO to have some brigades, several brigades stationed in some of our Eastern European allies, countries that are hungry for American leadership. But as we reduce and hollow out our military, it's not clear at all that we're going to have the resources to do that. A second example, you look at the turmoil in Asia. I think this administration actually, I'm very often very critical of this administration. I think that President Obama actually had the shell of a good policy with his Asian pivot when he announced that America was going to orient its attention and resources to the Asian Pacific region. Unfortunately, we haven't seen enough follow through to the rhetoric. And part of that challenge is we don't have the resources. You look at traditional U.S. allies like Taiwan, South Korea, and others, Japan, hungry for American leadership as a result of a resurgent China. But you've also got other countries like India and Vietnam and others also hungry for American leadership. It is hard for us to project that leadership when we're not investing in the Navy, we're not investing in our resources, enough resources into our military. And again, that's not an argument. I don't think either Jim or I are eager to deploy boots on the ground or deploy. But the irony is that when you strengthen your military, when you actually invest in your military, you're less likely to deploy that. Our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, was actually deployed troops less frequently than his predecessors, than his successors. And I think there's something to be learned. Peace through strength is not just a slogan. It can actually be a foreign policy strategy. Right now, we're doing the opposite. The result is our friends don't trust us, our enemies don't fear us. Where right now, America has not been a very good ally. So you look at how we've conducted our foreign affairs. In the Middle East, we have not stood unequivocally with Israel in their fight against Hamas. Sometimes we speak as if there were moral equivalents when there shouldn't be. When you look at Russia, we didn't start, look, the reset with Russia started back, this failed reset was announced by Secretary Clinton back in the first year of this administration. It included withdrawing the missile interceptors from Poland, from the Czech Republic. It involved not allowing Georgia to join NATO as they wanted to quickly. Putin didn't just wake up one day and think that he could go into the Crimea without consequences. He learned by watching the United States. You look at ISIS. We allowed this threat to gather strength because we prematurely withdrew our forces according to a political timeline in Iraq and created a vacuum. But here's my greatest concern. Of all those challenges, and we can go around the rest of the world as well, my greatest concern is what lesson are the Iranians taking from this chaos? Because we cannot allow there to be a nuclear-armed Iran. Not only for the sake of Israel and our European allies, that's an existential threat to the United States. And make no mistake about it. They get nuclear capabilities. The Saudis and certainly the Egyptians and maybe even Turkey would be the next countries. And it will be virtually impossible if the United States fails to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. We will not be able to stop those countries as well. And there's some that believe the Saudis already have an implicit agreement with Pakistan, an option on the technology from Pakistan if Iran does become a nuclear-armed power. And so this poses a huge threat to stability in the Middle East and a huge threat to our interests. My worry is, what are the Iranians learning from America's unpredictability in the world and our refusal to stand with our allies? And I worry this delay and this extension in terms of the negotiations may result in a deal that may be actually worse than no deal. And that would be a deal that would allow the Iranians to quickly constitute a nuclear weapon, to allow them to continue to accumulate centrifuges, allow them to continue to harden their facilities. Because right now we do have the ability to destroy their infrastructure. It gets harder and harder the more time they're allowed to progress down this path. And so I think one of the greatest challenges we face is the question of Iran. And what my concern is what they learn from our failed red line in Syria and our failure to act in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and you talked before about there's a certain, and we do in the paper, there's a fundamental sense in which defense policy is foreign policy because of the message that you're sending. And certainly we're in agreement, we discussed, we think that the administration has had a policy of when it's acted weak around the world, but it's magnified now by the fact that we are getting weaker. So, you mentioned some of our alliances. We talk in the paper about the various operating principles or the pillars of an integrated foreign policy, a strong defense, alliances, but also leadership. I mean, reaching out and managing risk before it gets to the level where it's difficult it's truly difficult, or you have fewer options in dealing with it. We want to discuss that in terms of our policy a little bit.
Absolutely. You know, look, I know it's very tempting to want to think that America can hide behind our oceans and pretend that the world is going to become magically a safer place. And I don't think anybody is arguing that, and certainly I'm not arguing that that America needs to become the world's policeman or try to become a dictator to other parts of the world or intervene in every single hotspot or send troops at the drop of a hat. Absolutely not. Having said that, we also now face asymmetrical threats. So the threats to our country's security are no longer just rogue nations or national actors, but they also, for example, include transnational, subnational groups, terrorist groups. They include cyber attacks, as we've seen in recent days. They include biological attacks. They include chemical attacks, other types of terrorist attacks. Hopefully they don't include, but they could one day include the potential for nuclear attacks, again, from either a rogue group or a rogue nation. And so we do face asymmetrical threats to our security, to our well-being. So, Jim, you're exactly right. We do need to first rebuild our hard tools, and we argue in the paper that, for example, that the last time we had a thoughtful approach to the military's needs, Secretary Gates did an actual assessment, said that he needed these resources to modernize while still achieving efficiencies. We are now $1 trillion below that, thanks to the president unilaterally throwing out his own Secretary of Defense's analysis and then sequestration cuts on top of that. We're $1 trillion below, and we're not arguing. We say in the paper we need to get back to approximately, and this is a guidepost, 4% of GDP to invest in our military. That's roughly, when you look at it, roughly $80 billion. We're not suggesting that needs to happen overnight. We don't think the Pentagon could spend that money well if given all that money overnight. But we need to work our way back up to that goal. We do argue, and I won't get into all the details in terms of procurement reforms and other acquisition reforms. We need to be more efficient and responsible with those dollars. But again, you're right, the defense is one component of this strategy. Secondly, we do need to be willing to lead, and we can't simply lead from behind. That is not leading at all. The reality is the world, even our enemies, need America to be a stronger, more predictable force for good. That leads to more order, less chaos. That leads to fewer instances of conflict, and that leads to more predictability. And even though our enemies may not acknowledge it publicly, they actually need America to play that role. No other country can play that role. You look at our traditional alliances. So 6 years ago, this president inherited the special relationship with Britain. We've seemingly done everything we could to alienate our traditional allies across the pond. Our neighbors next door, the Prime Minister calls this president his frustrator in chief over his refusal to approve the Keystone Pipeline. We seem to be doing everything to irk the always polite Canadians who live right next door to us. You look at our unpredictability vis-a-vis, I talked a little bit about our unpredictability vis-a-vis Israel, our ignoring traditional allies in Asia as well. We're doing everything we can to avoid leadership. Unfortunately, this administration seems to believe in multilateralism as a goal instead of merely a tactic. And the reality is we can't outsource our foreign policy to the world capitals. America must be willing to lead. We are the indispensable nation, and no other nation can fill that void. When we retreat from the world stage, nobody else can fill that void, and bad things happen when America leaves. That's why ISIS gathered strength. Here's my concern. If we retreat, when the inevitable day of reckoning comes, and it will come, our enemies are simply using that time and space to gather material, gather people, gather strength, gather resources, gather allies. When that day comes, it'll be more expensive in terms of treasure and American blood. Yeah. That day of reckoning won't go away. It'll simply be harder, more difficult for us to achieve victory. And that's why we argue you have to invest in the military, not just so you can win or draw any type of conflict to a draw, but so that you can dominate, and so that our enemies will be deterred from challenging America, our interests, our allies. Now, this also includes a use of soft tools as well, encouraging movements towards freedom and peace, and encouraging allies as well. One of my other concerns with our administration's policies, in addition to their embracing multilateralism as a goal, is their naive belief that simply giving a speech makes everything okay. You know, if giving a speech was the equivalent to having a policy, we'd have the best foreign policy in a generation. We've got one of the most gifted speakers in the White House who loves to give these great speeches, loves to talk. Sometimes we need to take action, and our rhetoric becomes more forceful and backed up by the credible threat of action. That's what's been missing. So there are things we can do. One of the things we haven't talked a lot about, and I hope that it was discussed today, was the use of energy and the development of energy as a component of our foreign policy. And you look at the falling oil prices and what has happened with the shale revolution, if this administration would actually encourage more development on federal lands instead of decreasing production there, this administration would make it clear that the EPA is not going to be shutting down fracking, that it acknowledges that it can be done safely and at the same time protecting our environment. If this administration would stop trying to discourage energy development at home and drive these manufacturing jobs overseas, think about the pressures we could be continuing to place on Iran, on Venezuela, and on Russia. And we're already seeing some of that with falling oil prices. Building the Keystone Pipeline creates all kinds of refining opportunities in the Gulf Coast. It helps, especially in Texas. It allows Canada to sell us their resources instead of looking at China. It puts these resources in a pipeline instead of by rail or other alternative means of transportation. But one of the things that doesn't get discussed as much is it has a direct and heavy impact on Venezuela, who it would absolutely displace much of that oil that's now coming from Venezuela, the heavier oil that's coming from Venezuela that's now being refined along the Gulf Coast. Talk about a great win-win. Helps an ally, helps our economy, but also weakens a country that has been working against America's interests. So energy policy can absolutely and should be a component of what we are doing to advance our interests and to cause those in Russia, those in Iran, those in Venezuela to rethink some of their actions and some of their whether it's Iran becoming a nuclear power, whether it's Venezuela trying to export their ideology to their neighboring states, or whether it's Russia threatening their Eastern European neighbors.
Yeah, it's an integrated approach to the world so that people see the United States understanding its interests. We'll get to that in just a second. Confident and rational in support of them. And that creates a sense of predictability, confidence, and security. And you're right. I mean, even prospective adversaries want to know that we know what our interests are and we're willing to act in accordance with that. You mentioned very briefly Iraq, and I want you to discuss a little bit what I think was the biggest mistake the administration's made, and that's saying something because we both believe there have been a fair number of mistakes, which was not leaving a footprint of 15 to 20,000 American troops in Iraq in a non-combat role. Because you mentioned the fact that if you don't deal with risks at the lower level, they tend to grow. This is the classic, this is what historians will write, I think, as the textbook example. So talk a little bit more in detail about how doing that might have prevented the chain of events that has now involved us in a fight against an Islamic caliphate.
Absolutely. I mean, you look and you see, and hopefully the administration is learning from history, though it's not clear that they are. At least you saw the Status of Forces Agreement recently signed with Afghanistan, and hopefully they've learned. The big mistake they made in Iraq, quite frankly, was to obey a political schedule and timeline as opposed to listening to the military commanders, the advisors on the ground, who continue to caution them about this withdrawal. The reality is that by creating a void, by insisting that we were pulling out all these troops by this date certain, and I get it. I get the domestic political pressures. I get why it's popular to want to bring every man and woman in uniform home, but without leaving a residual force, without leaving some kind of a force that could respond, we created a vacuum. We lost the ability to pressure, we at least diminished greatly our ability to pressure the Maliki government. You saw now this government begin to take very aggressive actions, exacerbating the Shia-Sunni divide in Iraq. We lost our ability. You think how different this might have been if we had maintained our influence, if we maintained a residual force. And nobody's talking about keeping troops at the height of their deployment in terms of the surge, but at least we'd kept a residual force. So think of our ability to increase pressure on the government to include in a meaningful way the Sunnis. Think about the ability to have filled that void so that certainly ISIS would not have metastasized into this transnational threat. Now, certainly, maybe it could have still become an actor in the region, but you wouldn't see this threat now crossing. At the very least, would have been able to seal the border with Syria. So you wouldn't have this group going across those borders, causing these refugees, potentially destabilizing neighboring countries, sending all these refugees into Jordan and elsewhere. Think about how different it would have been if instead of just listening to a political timeline, we'd actually done what our commanders, what folks were advising on the ground. But remember, this was an administration that was so eager to announce that al-Qaeda was defeated. that we were done. And again, I get it. As a bumper sticker, it's very attractive to say we're going to only do nation building at home. We're going to retreat from the rest of the world. And I don't want to see American troops deployed unnecessarily. I don't want to see us setting boots on the ground unnecessarily. I don't want us to be in the middle of every hotspot. This is a case, however, where our interests were suggested a different course of action and required a different course of action, especially when you think of the treasure and blood that were spilled to get Iraq to the point where it was. Think about the contrast today. Now under new leadership, so just this week, Iraq, the government has it seems from outward appearances, they're reconciling with the Kurds. They've got an agreement on oil, on revenues. They've got an agreement on the export of oil. And you're seeing them work to at least begin to address some of those divisions that were allowed to fester with the absence of our pressure. And I think, again, it's a great example, unfortunately a tragic example, but a great example of what happens when America unilaterally withdraws and creates a void. Bad things happen. And we saw that in Iraq. Hopefully they've learned the lesson in Afghanistan. Hopefully we don't just go after al-Qaeda and ISIS. And you're hearing the military advisors again tell the administration we need troops on the ground in Afghanistan to counter the ISIS threat and also to go after the Taliban, not just al-Qaeda. Hopefully we won't repeat the mistakes we made in Iraq. I do think the status of force agreement was a good sign. I hope this administration will jettison this idea of artificial deadlines, political deadlines, and instead, I don't understand, even if we don't think an action makes a sense in our interest, I get that. I'm not sure why we unilaterally need to announce that to the enemy, to the rest of the world. By the way, don't worry, we will leave at this date certain. And by the way, we're taking armed forces off the table. That's fine if internally we've made that decision, but there's no reason to tell an enemy what we will or will not do.
I've always had the same. The president might have that timeline in his own mind, fair enough.
Sure.
Might even communicate it to the allied government to let them know we need you to be doing more. But why announce it to the world? I mean, it gives an incentive to the enemy to try and hold on until the deadline. And by the way, makes your friends in country, it's so important to recruit supporters, insecure about your commitment to staying in the longer term. That doesn't make any sense. It's possible that whole chain of events. Now, you can't say for certain, but had we stayed in Iraq, had a footprint, it's possible the whole Syrian thing goes down differently. I'm not sure that Iran and Russia dare intervene. And you're right, we could at least have sealed that border off. So that's a good example.
Well, Jim, very quickly, two things. You're exactly right. If we had the residual troops in Iraq, and if when we said that crossing the red line meant something, but actually had meant something, I think we'd be in a very different place today in regards to ISIS and the chaos we now see in Syria that threatens their neighboring countries as well. So I think you're right.
You're careful about drawing red lines. You don't draw a lot of red lines. It's better, particularly when you're talking about weapons of mass, it's better to keep it, because if you draw a red line, it tempts people to go up to the red line, for one thing, right? Sure. And then what about things you don't mention? But if you're going to draw it, you have to keep it. You're right. I want to go back real briefly because you talked about the 4%, which we discussed in the paper as a guideline for defense. And there has been, and to be fair, not just in the last 3 years, defense spending tended to be cyclical in the post-war era, up, down, up, sure, down, up, down. So talk just a little bit more about how having rules of thumb like that and having more consistent funding actually can save money.
Absolutely.
And we can give some examples of that too. But.
Absolutely. No, you're exactly right. Look, with the feast or famine, unfortunately, what that encourages is that when we do need to spend the money, it becomes less efficient to do so. We decimate our industrial base. You don't have multiple suppliers. One of the things we talked about was procurement reform. So we shortened the product development cycle to 5 to 7 years so the technology is not obsolete by the time we deploy it. We have multiple suppliers. You've got competitive bids. You hold management accountable to being on budget, on time. You give real authority and accountability within the Pentagon so you don't have 100 different meetings to get things approved. And we talk in detail about how you streamline that. But part of the challenge by this feast or famine approach is that there is no predictability. It results in bad planning. So we end up developing very expensive weapon systems that we don't end up buying. We put them on the shelf. They become obsolete. And we have to develop new ones to replace them. Now, when it comes to the 4%, it needs to be based on a strategic assessment of our real needs. This doesn't mean give the Pentagon a blank check. But what's so disturbing about our budget today is the last time there was a credible review, bottom-up review process was when then Secretary Gates came forward and said, this is what we need for modernization, for training. And he himself suggested efficiencies. He himself suggested programs that could be consolidated or canceled. And instead of countering that with a different analysis, the administration, the president literally picked a number out of thin air. There was no defense or rationale for it. Said, no, instead we're going to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from his own Secretary of Defense's budget. And then on top of that, Congress exacerbated the situation. Now, we are asking Congress to do something that's unnatural. Both of you and I served in Congress. We are asking them to give up some of their power, because part of what we cannot allow this to become is just simply an excuse. This is not a jobs program. This isn't simply, well, we're going to give the Pentagon money so they can spend it in every district on politically connected or favored contractors or industries or groups. This needs to be really driven by a strategic assessment. And you've seen the explosion in civilian contractors and civilian employees at the Pentagon. Clearly, there are opportunities to do more with less. And so this is not an excuse for waste or inefficiency, but it is saying that a guideline to let you know when you're maybe underinvesting, and also maybe when things have gotten too high. At least a guideline to say this is, and it's, by the way, it's something we require our NATO allies. Now, I say we require, we say it to them, and they routinely disregard these guidelines. But we've asked them to commit to 2% of their GDP towards defense spending. Again, with the idea that it makes sense for everybody to have a shared expectation that this is what it takes. And it does save money, because not investing now makes it much more costly when we're going to have to. One of the things we also did in the paper was we differentiated that part of what masked the decline in defense spending, and it's been going on. Look, this administration is certainly hollowing out our military, but it would be a mistake to simply say it's only started under this president's watch. The reality is we've seen a decline in investment going back for now several years in multiple administrations. So this didn't happen overnight, which is why we're not suggesting to give all that money back overnight, but rather phasing it in. But one of the things that I think that you also we have to understand is that when it does come time, when that inevitable day of reckoning does happen, it will be a lot more expensive if then we're having to ramp up overnight. And it is also unconscionable. If we're going to ask American troops to go out there and defend our freedoms and be on the front lines, we owe it them. We owe it to them to give them the best readiness, the best training, the best technology and equipment. One of the things you've got to look at is the rise of China. China is not inevitably our enemy in Asia, but the way they're going about reasserting their power is certainly antithetical to our allies and the way that we have conducted ourselves. And part of what we can do to change our calculation is to reinvest and rebuild our Navy, and we're not doing that right now.
They're certainly a pacing threat. They're
That's right.
becoming, if they're not already, a pure competitor of the United States, which we've not had, of course, since the Cold War days, and I think a lot of people are unaware of that. I want to emphasize a couple of points you just made. When you have defense spending going like this and like this, when you talk about procurement and modernization, of course you procure these platforms from the private sector, and if they don't have predictability, this is true in any segment of the economy, if they don't have enough predictability, it's very difficult for them to be efficient and to make the kinds of investments they need. If you want competition, you got to have competitors, right?
That's right.
And if you cut real low and force structure goes down, and now the troops, you don't have enough people to do the jobs, and then you have to overwork the ones you do have, and it's a volunteer service, and you got to pay them if you want to keep the good ones. And you got to have good benefits. So then your personnel costs start going up, and pretty soon you're spending, it's just eating up any savings that you thought you were getting on it. So I'm glad you made that point. You're entirely correct. Because we want to have some time for questions, so let's go back here at the end, because we talked about rebuilding a consensus, which means initially and as a fundamental matter explaining why defense matters, which we did at the beginning of the paper. So talk a little bit about that, though. What are the interests? What are the packages of interest that together constitute American national security? What do we really mean when we're talking? We mentioned one, of course, defense of the homeland.
Sure. Now, that's obviously, the most natural one is the defense of the homeland. But look, we live in a much more connected global world than ever before, and in many ways that leads to greater productivity and greater integration with other societies, other economies, and that's a great thing. But it also makes us more vulnerable to cyber attacks, biological attacks, nuclear attacks, to chemical attacks, to terrorist and asymmetrical attacks. There was a thought that post-Cold War we were free of existential threats to our homeland because the Soviet Union was no longer that threat. And then we saw in 9/11 that it wasn't true that we were free from those existential threats. Let's be clear, the attack, in addition to killing so many innocent American lives and other innocent lives with the Twin Towers and the other attacks, also was meant to be an attack, not only a symbolic, but a material attack on our ability to conduct commerce, to travel safely, to live our daily lives. And so there are other interests as well, but I think there's an important
I would say about the freedom of trade and travel. which the United States has protected for so long, everybody just takes it for granted. Every time that's been interfered with consistently, we've ended up in a war.
That's right.
I mean, going back to the War of 1812, that's the lead up to World War I, the lead up to World War II. It's an essential national interest of the United States. And, you know, if the Strait of Hormuz, there's a reason we keep that open. So it's a good point.
That's right.
I couldn't resist you.
The sea lanes, and you look at how much of our economy and commerce depends on that international movement of people and goods and services. But I think there's an important point to make. When you look at America vis-a-vis other historic great powers, America's interests are relatively benign compared to other great powers. They are completely benign compared to the rest of the world in the sense that we're not empire builders. We're not seeking preferential treatment. What we're simply seeking is the right to be our citizens, our people, our services, our goods, to be treated on a fair and equal basis as others, and to be protected as, whether it's in terms of international commerce or in terms of being here in the homeland. I think that's an important point. We're not, in the traditional great power sense, we're not looking to conquer other territories, to enforce or impose our ways on others. And I think that there is a shared bipartisan consensus that we are looking to live in peace with others who want to live in peace with us. We're not seeking conflict. We don't have these imperial ambitions, but we are seeking, and it's not enough to simply say that we want to be left alone. The world's not going to leave us alone. You know, we can pretend all we want, and that's simply not an option. And we may all wish it were an option, but our real option is, do we engage those risks at an early point where we can mitigate and reduce those risks, or do we wait till they gather force and strength? It's much better for us now to be engaged in Asia and reassuring our allies and rebuilding our Navy and protecting our interests than to wait for China to continue to gather strength and influence to a point then where we may find fewer willing actors wanting to ally themselves with us, because the reality is they do see a resurging China. They do want to ally with us, but that window is only open for so long before they will make the decision that America is not serious about that Asia pivot.
That was a point we made early in the paper, and if you read it, I hope you all will focus on that America is unique for a lot of reasons. It's exceptional for one of them is that we define our national interests in a defensive and benign way, and we're perfectly willing to have others enjoy the rights that we're seeking for our own people on exactly the same terms in which we enjoy them, which is one of the reasons, for example, in Asia, the countries and the regional countries there are comfortable with American presence and primacy in the region, but not so much with China, because China does not necessarily define its national interests the same way. Well, I thought, Chris, maybe we could take some questions. I want people to have plenty of time, so let's do that. How do you having the moderators do? You want me to call on them?
If you'll call on them,
Okay, I'll just point it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there, Lisa Garcia, FOIA Resource Center. Thank you for your remarks. Okay. Hi, Lisa Garcia, FOIA Resource Center. Thank you for your remarks, Governor Jindal. It's a little bit follow-up on Senator Cruz's remarks, which you also parlayed off of. He addressed the drone issue and what a national security risk that was. I wish he would address the same topic, but relating to ICANN, the U.S. Deciding to dispose of that property and how that affects our national security. Thanks.
Sure, and I'll be honest, I didn't hear the senator's remarks, but I'll certainly answer your question. So I don't know if I'm repeating what he said or okay. I thought it was a mistake for us to relinquish ICANN. I know that this administration was, and fortunately there was bipartisan. It wasn't just Republicans that spoke up and said, wait a minute, this is a dangerous precedent. I'm also, for similar reasons, very concerned about this proposal for the government to be more, and I know this is slightly, I know we're talking about FPI, about foreign policy, but I'm also have similar concerns about the government, the federal government trying to impose itself in terms of, defining and imposing net neutrality through more regulations through the FCC. And here are my concerns, twofold. One, the internet needs to be a place where it continues to be operated openly with free speech and open access, and I worry about the government getting in the business of deciding to pick winners and losers or advantaging one group over another. I certainly am very much more worried about it being done by an international body as opposed to a body subject to American jurisdiction and laws. But my first concern about the American government is that we have seen a series of scandals that, to me at least, were unimaginable. You know, if you'd gone back 10 years and asked me, did I really think that the IRS would go after conservative groups, I would have said no. If you would have asked me, legit, I would have honestly said, I actually don't think that the Department of Justice would spy on an AP reporter. I didn't think that would happen. We've seen that happen. And I think the American people are less and less trusting of our government because some of these, the accumulation of these scandals and the violation of some of our rights. I'm very worried about, first, the government trying to pick winners and losers or regulating or interfering with the internet. One of the things that's made it so effective, widespread, and one of the reasons it's so widely used and liked is the fact that it is open, it is a level playing field, and you do have access. Secondly, absolutely, I'm worried about, I'm worried in general. I think we have, in the last several years, we've gone more and more towards abdicating our rights towards these international bodies, whether it's a United Nations group. You know, the latest was and we didn't talk as much about this, but the president's recent announcement of his deal with China in terms of climate. And you look at that, and carbon emissions, you look at that. So now we're making an agreement where we're going to do harm to our economy in the short term for an unenforceable promise that in 2030, China will then choose to no longer increase their emissions. Well, one, doesn't that also give China a great incentive to increase their emissions in the short term to get that baseline up? I mean, I thought that was a little odd quirk. But secondly, it's also completely unenforceable. You know, and to my mind, it's almost like amnesty, the way the president's done it. It's his way of going around Congress, knowing he can't get something approved by Congress, to take unilateral action to hurt our economy, hurt our manufacturing base in particular. So I do worry about this trend towards deferring to international bodies and giving away American rights and prerogatives to these international, whether it's the example of ICANN or some of these other international agreements we've seen vis-a-vis the UN and other groups.
With regard to the climate change point, economic growth for the CCP, the Communist Party of China, is in their view a regime stability issue. In other words, their ability to deliver a better quality of life to their people is part of the basis by which they are claiming legitimacy in the absence of democratic elections. So to think that they are going to take steps which slows economic growth in the name of the priorities of our administration or the international community, I would be very skeptical of that. I don't think that, now, they have issues with pollution, but not so, it's an entirely different type of setting, and those I think they are going to work on. So, you know, again, this could be a situation where we have to do something, and the country that we've made a deal with doesn't have to do anything. And I'm really, I know you are too, getting tired of that. That was what New Start was also in terms of trading. Yes. Yes, sir.
This way the humanity go, it's not only United States, all planet, increasing weapon, military and sophisticated new technology for killing ourselves. This way have end, or it is endless way. You have end. What's end? We all die, or we live in paradise among nuclear, psychological, chemical weapons. What is end of all of this? I ask this question because I applied for the post Secretary General of United Nations. I have absolutely different, contrary politics, and I believe a point is this billions dollars for nothing now.
In terms of, I'll take a first shot. In terms of the question about the weapons, I'll quote Phil Graham in that, you know, I certainly, and I might get the quote a little off, but I think that the essence applies here. I do hope the lion and the lamb will lie peacefully together, but I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime. And if it does, I still want the United States to be the lion in that situation. I think the best way to achieve that peace is for America to be stronger. And I think that unilaterally making ourselves weaker has never led to peace or victory. And so I absolutely share your hopes and prayers for peace. I've got 3 young children. I hope they will be able to grow up in a world without strife and violence and chaos. I fear, however, in a world populated by human beings, that's not going to happen. I think that what is more likely to happen is if we can mitigate the risks, reduce the threats, reduce the chances of violence, the level of violence, and certainly continue to build towards peace. And the reality is we have made progress. I don't mean to be completely pessimistic at all or pessimistic at all. The reality is you look at countries that decades ago were at each other's throats are now reconciled allies. And so you look at Germany and Japan integrated into a post-World War II, a peaceful framework, living peacefully, coexisting peacefully with countries they had been at war with, in vicious wars with, and deadly, costly wars with. So certainly I think that we can make progress, but I think the best way to prepare for peace is for America ironically, to prepare for conflict. I think a weaker America actually invites more violence, more aggression, more instability, and more persecution. I think a stronger America, stronger allies actually decreases that chance and leads to more stability.
It gives a chance to point out another point we make in the paper that we didn't talk about before, but I think it's a really good one. It's wrong to view the world, for the United States to view the world as full of enemies. Most of the countries in the world we should view, we think, as allies or at least partners, potential partners for certain discrete things. And we talked about an agreement with China on pollution. I mean, a good agreement with China on pollution would not be a bad thing. We've worked with the Russians on locking down loose nukes. But there are some countries that are potential adversaries in the sense that they define their national interests in a way that brings them into conflict with us. The right kind of management should prevent those countries from becoming enemies. But there are a few rogue states and transnational movements, and we say this in the paper, who are just evil. And their vision of the future is their boot in everybody else's face. I think that's a quote from the paper. And the United States needs to defend and needs to be strong in dealing with those groups. Let's go over here. Yes, sir. Yeah. I'm sorry, can't see the names from here.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is about Senator McCain's statement. He was here earlier today, and he asked this question to Pakistani General Sharif, who was visiting Washington, that if current status in Afghanistan would be sustainable after we leave completely, and General said no. So do you have any plan B in the case if General's prediction turned out to be true? And second related question, that ISIS, they are doing recruitment in Pakistan and their next target might be India. So is there any, preparation for that? Thanks.
Sure, I think two things. One, I think you're exactly right, and I think the generals on the ground have made this point. I hope the administration has learned. I'm not confident they have. I hope they've learned from the lesson, the failure in Iraq. They did get a status of forces agreement. The new leadership in Afghanistan seems to be working better with our government. My hope is they've learned that lesson and understood that we cannot create that vacuum in Afghanistan. Now, this administration continues to commit itself to these artificial deadlines, these political deadlines, but I do hope that they've learned the importance of at least leaving a residual force that's able to help the Afghan government and people protect themselves, counter the Taliban, counter ISIS, counter Al-Qaeda. But you're right, that the generals have absolutely made clear they need more resources, and that America is going to have to fill the gap that some of our allies may be leaving by not living up to their commitments, that we're going to have to make sure there is at least a residual force that helps to train and support. Now, I'm not arguing that we do everything for everybody. Absolutely, it is right to ask the Afghan government and people to help defend themselves. It's in their own interest to do so. But we need to be ready to, especially when it's in our critical interest, to avoid the growth of ISIS. You asked about ISIS in Pakistan and potentially the threat to India. I think we need to recognize that ISIS absolutely has as its ambition the ability to become this, and not just a transnational movement in terms of a region in the Middle East, but really to spread across the globe into different countries and to pose a threat to us here in our homeland, whether that's through affiliates that merely have a loose association with ISIS or others that are taking direct marching orders, and it may be more the former. Regardless of the form of that relationship, ISIS absolutely has that ambition, which is why we cannot view it as our goal simply to contain them or expel them. We've got to eliminate them, and we've got to work wherever that is in the world, whether it's in the Pakistan-India region, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in other places. We need to understand what's at stake here. They're motivated by an evil ideology. We have to understand this is a group that has crucified innocent civilians. They have killed religious minorities. They've beheaded quite graphically and visibly prisoners. They have absolutely crossed every line imaginable in terms of moral lines, and clearly this is a force of evil, and this is a group that needs to be exterminated, not contained, not expelled, but exterminate wherever it rears its ugly head, whether that's in Pakistan, whether that's in the Middle East, whether that's in Afghanistan, wherever they might try to recruit followers, wherever they might try to create affiliates, wherever they might try to grow. We need to eliminate them and work with others to eliminate them. And this shouldn't just be America's fight alone. We need to be willing to lead, but we need to be able to also draw others into that fight, and it's in their interest to do so as well.
It's important to remember the point of both conflicts was not just to remove a particular regime, but to work with the people of the country, Iraq and Afghanistan, to help create a new government that would become over time a working partner with the United States on behalf of mutual interests. And that was really where the benefits, we would have enjoyed the benefits of the conflict in the sense in Iraq. And we had that opportunity in our grasp and gave it up. Yes, behind the gentleman I'll get that gentleman back there. That's you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Alex Ovakir. I'm with the Alexander Hamilton Society, a senior at Princeton University. I want to thank both of you for your remarks today. My question is in response to something you said a little earlier. You talked about how we have a great speaker in the White House, and I think this is true. So one of the questions I have is, even if we can beat the descending curve of defense spending and bring it back up, it'll be years before we see measurable results in terms of new capabilities. But one of the concerns today is conventional states that traditionally used conventional means to deter or coerce are now using hybrid or unconventional means, Russia being the latest example on the ground, but also China in terms of what it could do one day. What can the U.S. do in the meantime, in the near term and midterm, to try and deter this, even if there are other contingencies around the world that will require us to potentially meet unconventional hybrid threats with a conventional force that just might not be the right military hard power?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Three things real quickly. One, you're right, it will take time, but I do think those early investments send important signals. So even President Carter changed course. His last year in office started reinvesting in the military after the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. I would argue it was too little too late. But then Ronald Reagan came in, his first 2 years, double-digit increases in spending. It got the attention of other countries very quickly. And even though it took a few years for that to result in more troops and more technology, it quickly signaled to the world that America was serious. And it caused, I would argue, a change of behavior, and ultimately, I think, helped speed up the fall of the Soviet Union. So those signals are important. And look, that's why, even though I'm not, I think we need to continue to try to give this president the opportunity to do the right thing. I'm not optimistic he will suddenly change his ways his last 2 years, but let's give him the chance. President Clinton started signing balanced budgets after the Republicans took Congress. He signed welfare reform after vetoing it with the Republican majority. Carter changed directions his last year. There is still time for this president to change direction. Secondly, when it comes to these, you talked about, and gave as examples, national actors like Russia and China, we need to understand there are other pressure points on those countries as well. So, for example, I think Putin took great notice of the fact that Germany under Merkel actually has now sent a message to him that his behavior is not acceptable. And I think that was a wake-up call. I think his treatment in Australia at the G20 conference was another wake-up call. I think part of his calculation is certainly economic, and part of it is domestic politics. Part of it is international prestige, that they think that they feel like he feels like they lost after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so I think there are other ways to change that calculation. I would argue, for example, more oil and gas production, more export of our petrochemical products puts a huge pressure on the Russian economy in addition to sanctions. And so as Europe is able to diversify their energy sources, puts huge pressures on Russia. And so now they're trying to sell their resources to Turkey, who's got great concerns with what they're doing in Syria. So all of a sudden there are ways to change the calculations of these countries to make it clear to them that it's not in their best interest to continue to violate international norms, to threaten American interests. The same is true of China. As dependent as we are on China to finance our out-of-control government spending, they're also still dependent on access to our markets. They're still, quite frankly, dependent on our guarantee of the safety of travel and commerce on those sea lanes. And so there are ways to pressure China, and part of that is being visibly present in Asia. The president was right. There are things we could do with the TPP in terms of also strengthening our ties to countries in that region and giving them another outlet in addition to China. And it's not simply strengthening our ties with those countries has a twofold purpose. It's not simply as a hedge against China, but it's also strengthening our relationships with these countries that want to build that relationship. But to the third point I want to make, and this is a very, very important question, because that was fine and good when responding to national actors. But you could also apply your question to non-national, subnational, transnational actors who asymmetrically can threaten our interests. And you're exactly right. Those become much harder to deter and to counter. That's why it's so important to root them out, to destroy them where they are, to take the fight to them. But then we've also got to harden our infrastructure. The reality is we've got to take those steps to secure the homeland. And you know, again, there are trade-offs and costs involved in doing that. It's not free. It's not easy to do so. But we've got to make ourselves less vulnerable. One of the things I know that the president announced this deal allowing us, you know, this IT deal with China, and that's all fine and good. I wished he'd raised this issue of cyber warfare while he was over there. That's going to be a huge threat to our economy, to our national interest, and a lot of it originates, not all of it, but a lot of it originates in China. And so I think when it comes to these transnational, subnational groups, we've got to take the fight to them because unlike national actors, you know, it is harder to put these other pressures on them. We got to take the fight directly to them to disrupt their capabilities to attack us. And then, unfortunately, one of the things we got to do is harden our own infrastructure. I say unfortunately because it does have a cost in terms of resources and inconvenience and their friction. There'll inevitably be, and that's a balancing act. You can go overboard in that. I'm not suggesting we do because that can interfere with our very freedoms and way of life. But there are things we're going to have to do to harden our own infrastructure against those transnational actors.
Yes, in the middle here. That's you, sir.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. Earlier I asked a question in a prior session about the Bretton Woods Agreement and whether restoring a new Bretton Woods Agreement might bring some stability, a honest unit of account between nations of gold money. And as a governor, I'd like to raise a question in a constitutional context. Andrew Jackson ended the Second Bank of the U.S. Saying that a circulating coin and silver or gold and silver coin money was meant to protect the wealth of the laboring class from being inflated away by the largest corporations, financiers, and politicians, just conjuring more and more credit into existence. For example, financing an ever-expanding military-industrial complex. Article 1, Section 10, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. It seems that at the level of governor in every state, the states could require the federal government to reinstitute an honest circulating money. I just ask your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that I want to address the bigger issue you raised. I do worry when we just recently exceeded $18 trillion of accumulated debt. We've got a Fed through quantitative easing has explicitly said they're taking action because Congress and the White House couldn't or wouldn't in terms of what they saw as threats to our economy. I think we need to take a step back and think about that for a second. So we've got an unelected body, the Fed, saying, well, we're going to take action because the elected leaders, elected and accountable to the people of the United States, decided not to or wouldn't take that action. And you go back to those systemic debts that we're running. This president has never proposed a balanced budget. Not 5 years out. He hasn't said, I'm going to get to it tomorrow. We had a saying in Louisiana after the Macondo explosion that whenever you hear that help's coming tomorrow, that doesn't mean help's coming tomorrow. It just means it's not coming today. He's not even saying that he's going to balance the budget tomorrow. So I think to your bigger point, I am very worried for a lot of reasons. The dollar, look, it's been the reserve currency around the world, and for many reasons, the flight to stability during this world economic chaos. There are many reasons why the Fed has been able to get away with some of the things they've done, and our federal government's been able to get away with some of the things they've been doing. But it's not going to be free forever. And the reality is we cannot simply print our way out of this crisis. We cannot simply borrow and spend and tax our way out of this crisis. I think this is what happens when government is running at historically high levels of GDP. I think that's what happens when we're structurally spending much more than we're taking in, and historically than we have. One of the numbers we cite in the report is we are spending more as a share of our economy on government than we have had in the last 70 years, even while we're spending the least amount as a percentage of our economy in the last 70 years on defense, which is such a jarring contrast when defense is the only thing in the Constitution that the federal government is told it must do. The only thing, it's told you must defend the states. It's the one power given to the federal government that it's told they have to do. But to your point about, I'm sorry.
I was going to jump in for a second. Whatever else they're financing with this, I can assure you it's not an ever-expanding military-industrial complex. They've been cutting defense. Spent $800 billion in the stimulus package. Remember that? None of it went to defense. I mean, it was maybe 50, 60 million for military housing. In fact, if it had, we would actually spent the money on something the government's supposed to spend it on, and we'd have got something for it. But please, I interrupted.
The banks,
But-
the largest banks have flowed.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, but to your point, I do worry that when you really think about it, when you think on the path we're on, you look at the structural debts that we're running up, unless we start taking actions today, it's hard to see a scenario where we do avoid the devaluation of the dollar, where you do avoid a rapid growth in inflation. Well, my worry is it doesn't necessarily happen gradually. That one day, and nobody knows exactly when, but one day you could see tremendous pressure put on interest rates on American debt by bondholders, and it hadn't happened yet. And there are a lot of reasons it hasn't happened, with the dollar's status as a reserve currency, and again, the flight to stability, perceived stability. But here's what and I served in Congress for 3 years, for a couple of terms. I think that, and I'm glad, look, I'm personally glad that the Senate is now going to be in Republican hands and that we have a majority, but I don't think we should just think it's all going to change with a Republican majority in Congress. I think we have to make structural changes in our spending. Here are some things I think we need to do. I think we need a balanced budget amendment in the Constitution. I think it needs to be a supermajority vote before they can raise our taxes. I think that it needs to be a supermajority vote before government spending grows faster than the private sector economy. I think also I would add to that term limits to our members in Congress, as well as a prohibition from them simply leaving to go and be lobbyists or go and work for special interests. Now, people will tell you, well, you can't do that. All of that's in Louisiana state constitution. And so, for example, we cut our budget in the face of this recession. We didn't raise taxes. We don't have the ability to print money. I mean, we can't just go and say, well, we're going to go print a bunch of dollars to pay our bills. We cut our budget 26%, or $9 billion. Our private sector economy is doing better. I've got one final suggestion. We've got a part-time legislature. I'd like to see a part-time Congress. I'd also like to pay them differently. We pay our legislators on a per diem basis. I'd like to see us pay Congress on a per diem basis, but pay them for every day they stay out of D.C. rather than for every day they come to D.C. But I think you ask a very important question, and I think it's important for even Republicans to acknowledge that, look, the debt and spending grew tremendously when Republicans were in control. I think this president's he's taken it to a whole new level in terms of his spending and expanding government. But when Republicans were in control, the deficit was growing and spending was growing. We've got to be serious, and that's why it may seem odd to hear a fiscal conservative saying, well, yeah, we need to invest in defense. But I'm not for no government. I'm for a limited, effective government. And part of that is getting the government out of things it never should have been doing in the first place, focusing on its real priorities, and that should be defense. It is amazing to me. If you'd gone back, I asked the question about 10 years ago about the IRS, spying on, or not, the IRS going after conservatives and the DOJ spying on reporters. 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, would the federal government really create a new entitlement program when we can't afford the ones we've got, I never would have thought that that's what we'd be talking about today. So I think we're seeing reckless spending. It has happened on a bipartisan basis. I'm hopeful that people will listen, the people in D.C. will listen to the voters outside of D.C. and say, all right, enough's enough. Let's not just cut the growth in spending. Let's actually cut spending. Let's reduce the size of government, and let's prioritize what we're doing in this town. Because if we don't, I think we are headed for a day of reckoning that will be that will make this previous fiscal challenge and fiscal recession mild in comparison. And that's not something any of us should want for our children and grandchildren. Let's be honest what we're doing. We are stealing, we are borrowing, we are spending our children's and grandchildren's money today. I would argue none of us as parents would ever want to do that or should do that in our families. Why are we doing it as a country? Why are we doing it collectively through our government?
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Governor, and
Thank you, Jim.
And,
Thank you, Senator.